how do you get from apples to cider? And that's a lot of what we do in my research program. Hello, this is Greg Peck from Cornell University, located in Ithaca, New York, and you're listening to Cider Chat.
And this is episode 198. Welcome to Cider Chat. My name is Rhea Wincaller, and I am the producer and cider MC of this weekly podcast, where we speak with makers, cider enthusiasts, and folks within the cider trade from around the world. This week, we're featuring a chat with Gregory Peck, who is at Cornell University. He is in the School of Integrative Plant Science. We're going to be finding out a bit about what he's doing, his newest projects, and how you can become a pomologist. But first, a wee bit of news out and about in Ciderville. There is so much news going on right now because it's the fall and there's a lot of excitement and there's all these kind of different holidays happening throughout the world. So we're going to cover from California and then circle around to Russia. And starting in California, let's look in Oakland, which is going to be the site for CiderCon in 2020. That, I believe, is the last week of January. Oh, and by the way, I'm leading one of the 3 tours at CiderCon. I'm going to be leading the one that goes down to Watsonville, Cortalitos, and basically a mini piece of what I did for the Monterey Bay Cider Tour in April. So if you're heading to CiderCon, you might want to come along with me and some fun-loving cider folks going to CiderCon. It's going to be a fantastic day. So the news, though, in Oakland, I digress. There's so much going on. The news in Oakland is at Crooked City Cider, and that's with Dana Bushhouse. And there's going to be an upcoming episode with her, which I found so amazing talking to her. Against all odds, she has brought forward this cider bar, which is going to be a happening place during CiderCon. But I thought this was fun. You know, it's going to happen this weekend, so if you're listening in real time to the podcast when it goes live, which is only on August 23rd, then you have a little bit of time before the 26th, if you're in Oakland, to go to a Halloween Boo Bash. Because you got to be in the Halloween scene if you're in the U.S. If you're outside of the U.S., well, sometimes you find little neighborhoods here and there, don't you? But that's at Crooked City Cider. And then heading across country, and there's a lot of folks heading cross country now to New England because Franklin County Cider Days is going to be happening the following weekend in my spot of Ciderville. And you do have, only like 2 more days. I'm closing the cider tour, the second annual New England Cider Tour, on, what is it? It's going to be the 23rd, 24th, 25th, a Thursday, because I have to close it and kind of focus on so many things. I'm involved in a lot of workshops this year, trying to keep my task paper in a manageable way. I keep on thinking about John the Cider Maker, about trying to eliminate hurriedness, and that's kind of going well for me, but it's a little overwhelming, and I'm sure you know what I'm talking about if you're making cider right now. So that's happening in New England. Starts off with my tour, and then we go right into Cider Days. I'm actually going to be picking up some, I think it's Calvados, coming my way from Chicago. We have a little mule. We don't want to call Corey a mule. I've been working with Ambrosia Borowski at the Northman, who's been unbelievable for getting all these contacts to send brandy and Calvados to Franklin County Cider Days. And you might think, oh, that's not a big deal. You know, people ship all the time. But it is. It's quite involved. So we're going to have like 6 different tastings. And then I was contacted by a distillery down in Maryland, and they're bringing up their new apple brandy. So we're now going to have 7 tastes during that Calvados apple brandy tasting. And experience. It's going to be an experience for sure, kind of learning more about it and delving into it. And that's the kickoff event on Friday night. So a lot happening at Franklin County Cider Days. You've heard me talk about it. I'm going to just kind of move on from there. And now let's keep on rolling across the continent. And we're going to head next to Germany, where I recently heard from the Empress of Blandings. And you can follow the Empress of Blandings on Twitter. I'll put a link in the show notes, or you could just kind of put that in your Twitter Google search. It's Empress, EMPRESS of Blandings, BLANDINGS. And anyways, I got a reminder saying, probably now's a good time to ask people to start sending photos of medlars. I hope it's not too late, because that was about a week ago. And the Empress did send me a photo of some medlars that were picked up, which is really awesome. And if you don't know what a medlar is, you should definitely look it up.
Rhea, they don't know what medlars are?
Oh, by the way, there are medlars. There's part of the Talking Palm tribe here, the band, if you will. We do have the medlars here. And no medlars, not everybody knows what a medlar is.
Then this is a good opportunity to press the subscribe button for Cider Chat.
Yes, Mr. Quince, I know. That's why we have a podcast, to inform people, because they just don't know everything that's going on.
Well, I suspect that they also don't know what a peri-pear is, Rhea, if they don't know what a medlar is.
Yes, Perry, that is probably true. Peri-pears are very different than regular pears. But look, Palms, we got a lot going on, so let me keep on moving on.
Continue on, Rhea. I have it here in the control room.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Quince. I appreciate that. And by the way, that's the Talking Palms, who are often in the Cider House helping me produce this here episode. So, as I said, the Empress of Blanding reminded me about the medlar. So if you have a photo of the medlar, send it my way, and I will collect those photos and put it up on our different social media accounts here at Cider Chat. So you could see all the different varieties of medlars. There's, in our orchard we have
Breda and Royal.
Yes, medlars. We have Breda and Royal, and there's Nottingham, and there's Breda is like a Dutch. So, yes, definitely look at medlars. So that came in from Germany. Thank you very much, Empress of Blandings. Moving on, the other piece I want to talk about, we're going to spend a little time, because this is a pretty extensive letter, and I found it absolutely fascinating, and it's coming in from Russia. Maxim is a cider maker in Russia. Take a break here and come back and read this very informative letter to share with you about the culture that's happening there in cider for this huge country. So many root stocks are accredited to Russia. So I just find this absolutely fascinating. And then after that, we'll be moving on with Gregory Peck of Cornell University. I met up with Maxim via the Cider Chat Patreon page. He is a patron to Cider Chat. He is a commercial maker who wants to support the podcast and believes in, what it's doing, some of the value it's adding out there for cider. So that provided both of us an opportunity to have a conversation, an ongoing conversation. And I did read an email that he sent, and that was in a number of episodes this summer it came out. And I sent him a couple more questions, and it takes a while, because when you're not a native English speaker, translating from a totally different alphabet, and Russia has a very different alphabet than English, it takes a while. And I'm just so impressed that he took the time to do this, because there's some cool info that we wouldn't know otherwise from Russia. I mean, is there anyone like talking about Russia other than in that country or in our political sphere, which is not always a happy avenue? That's why the apple is just so beautiful, isn't it? It just helps us kind of cross those boundaries and make it universally. It's like apples for peace. So let's get into this, and I'm going to read it via the questions I asked and his answers. And it begins with, where I asked about licensing and how that worked for a commercial cidery. And Maxim writes, All government regulatory structures in Russia aim to punish businesses, not to help them grow properly. Big corporations can solve it easily with a bribe, but small businesses have to suffer. There is a huge number of laws and requirements from different government structures that you have to satisfy, especially hidden ones, like a surprise from an inspector that you can't use fermenters bought via a leasing program because you are not the owner of them. Or if your building is outside of a populated area and has no address, you can't get a license. All these requirements covered with juridical fog. You could read the laws, but it is very difficult to make clear step-by-step algorithms where to go, which documents and to whom you have to provide, and what are the exact parameters for your cidery to check. So he gave an example here. For example, there is a lot of manufacturers who made huge amounts of mass cider from concentrate, but only about 30 to 40 of those who make it from pure fresh juice, and only about 5 who make it legally. All others ask each other about the ways of legalization. Wow. So think about that. When you think that you're having difficulty in your country or wherever you are making cider in the world, think about some of these roadblocks here. It just never makes sense. I mean, why would a government want to stop good, solid commerce in this way? It just doesn't make sense to me. But continuing on, for Maxim, the problem for him is the expense. He should have a long-term rent contract at a food-grade building, but that is too expensive for his current amount of 5,000 bottles. Next, I asked him about the size of the cidery, and he had mentioned that he had taken Peter Mitchel's course when he had been in the UK a couple years back now. He writes, "My cidery is 4 by 5 meters, which equals 13 by 16 feet. Isn't that interesting? I wonder if lumber is cut differently. Like in the U.S., we have stock lumber, which is like 12 or 14 feet and 16 feet, but 13 times 16 is just kind of an unusual size for a building, but so be it. That's just a difference of meters and whatnot. Again, so he writes his cidery is 4 by 5 meters, and he can make 3,000 liters there, but it is insanely difficult. He has to move something all the time and is always breaking something. Oh dear. He dreams about a bigger room. Regarding Peter's course, it was really helpful to structure his knowledge and to build a wide view of different approaches. It made me less anxious about the future unknown things. But I also do my own research and make a lot of experiments, read scientific articles about microbiology, fermentation, wine industry engineering, and so on. And I think now I went much further since Peter's course. At the same moment now, I have many more questions than answers." Isn't that the way it goes, Maxim? That such goes life, right? All in all, the process consists of typical stages and scale and quality of this process, and it is a question of your resources. Now I see it as a constructor. If you couldn't afford a chiller for disgorging, get the dry ice for that. No fermenters with cooling jacket? You can rebuild using a cheap air conditioner to cool the whole room. So you can see what he's doing there is being, enterprising, and you have to be experimental. And I think Maxim's woes in cider making are not uncommon for other people in the world. You have a baseline course, but the fact is you can't make cider out of a book. You have to do it. You have to have trial and error. And to become a master at anything, you got to put in your hours of work. Shoot, I've been making cider for 25 years, and I feel like such a novice. I don't want to let that deter anybody. I'm not a commercial maker. I'm just, I'm a hobbyist, right? That's the beauty of it as an art and a science. We continued on where I asked him about people's cider preferences in Russia, and he writes, "The vast majority of people prefer medium sweet and sweet ciders, which are the most common in retail. You could find dry ciders only in special shops and places. Only a small part of the audience is ready to appreciate dry ciders. One reason is our apples. Only dessert apple varieties are available, and this is why all Russian ciders are quite acidic, and they offer no complexity because of the properties of varieties and lack of good cider-making practices. On the other hand, Our wine industry is growing in the last couple of years. More and more good Russian wines appear, and due to this, the audience of wine drinkers who are ready to cope with dryness in search of complexity and nuances is also raising too. Also, I have found that cider made from natural, fresh pressed juice helps people to like dry and acidic cider. Again, commonality across the board. We just know that cider is kind of like a new experience for so many countries. Again, I always try to keep out the older cider regions of the world. They are just an entity unto their own. I mean, my God, they in Asturias, they've been drink cider every night and have a party every night around cider in the Basque region. It's so cool there. But other than that, it's pretty darn common. And you should know, too, that he is going to be at the Cider Expo in France, which is taking place over the weekend of February 13th, 14th, and 15th, I believe. It's going to be in Caen in Normandy, France. I guess there's Russian representatives of the Institute of Enology of Champagne, and they're going to be having Maxim's sparkling ice cider made by the traditional method. And they're going to be presenting it at the exhibit there. Pretty cool. So there'll be some Russian cider in France, which is a great opportunity. And I am hoping to be at that Cider Expo and to meet Maxim and other Russian delegates. What an opportunity, right? This is kind of the bridge that kind of builds over all the different gaps in society. I just love cider for that. He said, "That's it for the moment. Thanks for your cider chat again. It's a great opportunity to get virtually in touch with people from the cider world." Yes, it is, Maxim. Best of luck to you. And I also want to say that there was a full feature written about Maxim in the Real Brew magazine. And I'm going to be posting that at the Cider Chat Patreon page. He has it all translated here into English, and then I'll see if I could also get a copy to go out onto the Facebook page. So cool stuff happening around the world in cider. And when we come back, we're going to be coming back to this side of the avenue. Oh, I want to say one more thing. I just want to finish around the world. So we have Russia, and we're going to go to Japan. The latest issue of Insider Japan is just out right now. That's put out by Lee Reeve, who's working his tail off to really help promote the Japanese cider market. And I have a subscription to Insider Japan. I recommend that you do too. It's easy. Just Google it online and find out, what's happening around the world. Keep on connecting the dots. And in turn, when we continue connecting the dots, cider continues to rise, not only in one spot of Ciderville, but around the world.
Walking through the orchards, dancing in the streets, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet.
Next up is our featured chat with Dr. Gregory Peck at Cornell University, based in Ithaca, New York. And Greg and a number of people were recorded during the recent Cider Week in the Finger Lakes region. And this event was just fantastic. And I had the golden ticket to be able to attend this and be sponsored by the following folks in this region, namely Visit Ithaca, who really pulled this whole tour together for me, and that was both Kendall and Heather, who are just working tirelessly to promote their regional products, and specifically cider, where they received a grant for that. I highly recommend that you listen to episode 196, which was titled Goat Zen to Cornell, and that provides a backdrop of my tour there with a number of sightseeing tips if you're headed to the Finger Lakes region, which it should be on your top list of regions to go to because there's so much to do in such a small area. It's really accessible. And then the following cideries help sponsor this tour for me, and that is Bellwether Cider and Wine, Black Diamond Cider, South Hill Cider, the Finger Lakes Cider House, and they had their brand, the Kite and String Cider, and then Redbird Cider. They were all in this like little span of miles that were so close together, and each dynamically doing something a little bit different, making it so interesting for me. And I assure you, it will also be very interesting for you too. So there'll be a number of episodes rolling out of here. But I thought I would take the opportunity to go straight to this conversation with Dr. Gregory Peck, someone who I've been trying to sit down long enough to have a conversation with him. And I always thought it was going to happen at CiderCon, which is the annual trade conference put on by the United States Association of Cider Makers. But wouldn't you know it, I had an opportunity to sit down in his office with the door closed, right outside of Peck Laboratory, not library. Probably be a library after him, no doubt, where some of the grad students that he's working with were working on projects. So I took a bit of a video clip there. It was so interesting, and I will be posting that onto YouTube so you could just see the inner workings of a university laboratory that is studying apples to help all the folks like you and I who love cider become a little bit more informed about the components bringing that together. And he brought us into the beginning of this here episode talking about that research, and we're going to dig in deeper. And I was very curious about his current research and what it takes to become a pomologist. So we're going to go through a whole range of topics, and it's such a pleasure for me now to head to this main conversation, a definite cider chat with Dr. Gregory Peck of Cornell University in Ithaca, New York.
First thing to do if you want to enter into a new commodity, even if you grow apples, to grow cider apples is a different entity. And so that was the first project, was how much does it cost to grow cider apples? And the second part of that project was, okay, you're an apple grower. You grow all these apples. You know how to sell them to the fresh market industry, galas and Honeycrisp and other varieties that you might see in the supermarket. But then you have to make a decision. You have 10 acres. Are you going to plant galas? Or are you going to plant Dabinet? Are you going to plant Hughes crab? Are you going to plant any number of these varieties that no one's really grown commercially in the United States in a very long time, and some probably never really had much production here in the United States, even when there was a cider, not so much industry, but there was quite a bit of cider production, in the pre-Prohibition era.
Mm-hmm. And so that's what you worked on. I want to back up to that first project in terms of the economy of scale. There's different ways to grow an orchard. So what was your specific study? Because there's like the permaculture, there's the biodynamic, there's organic, there's the industrial.
Yep.
So what was your study there?
Yeah, great question. So, and you hit on a really great topic too, because how do we grow these apples is a lot of what we're still trying to figure out.
Yeah.
And so not only are there different techniques in terms of how you're going to manage pests and diseases and weeds, which would be, you're going to be permaculture, biodynamic, organic, conventional, or somewhere else in that, spectrum, depending on what your personal philosophy is or what you think that the people buying your fruit want you to do. So for that first study, we modeled it after a conventional orchard using what we call a vertical axe type of system. So it's this kind of dwarfing trees. By today's culinary apple production, I would say it's not very high density, but it's high density compared to some of the traditional orchards that you would see in Europe, for example, in England and France, where they are still kind of growing almost standard sized trees. And the reason why we chose that was because the economic models were based on surveys and interviews that we did with growers. We started in Virginia, and then we interviewed people that we could find who were actually growing cider apples in New York and all the way up through New England. And so at the time, in 2011, there was only a handful of those folks, probably many of whom you've had on the show at one point or another and interviewed. And so we also interviewed them, but we were after lots of facts and figures and trying to get information about how widely you're spacing your trees.
Yeah.
What kind of yields are you getting? What kind of prices are you getting? how much disease control do you need to do, insect control, how does that compare to if you grow culinary apples, how does that compare, are you doing less inputs? So we weren't trying to say this is how you do it, we were trying to say, okay, this is kind of what the industry, not really, again, industry is kind of in a loose term because at the time there wasn't really an industry so much as a handful of producers who were, really kind of thinking ahead, I'd say, or really kind of doing something that was probably deemed to be, a little outside of the norm at the time. So those economic models and can share the website with you, are available for free for download.
That's what I was wondering. Yeah. So we want to give a touchstone for the listeners for that for sure.
Yeah, let's make sure it gets on your website and people can link to it. And a great thing about it that we built is a Excel spreadsheet where anybody could go in and say, okay, this is what they came up with for what their costs were going to be, but I know my costs are going to be lower, or I know my costs are going to be higher, or I know I'm going to have a higher density tree spacing, and all of that is editable in the Excel spreadsheet so that you can come up with a customized budget for your orchard. So it gets very technical. But that was the kind of information that we really needed to get out first, right? Is it worthwhile to grow these apples? The cider maker said, yes, it's worth it because we need this fantastic juice quality. We need more phenolics. We need more, these flavors, and we need to start growing European cider apples or even heirloom American cider apples. And but growers have to make this decision because they're business people, and they have to say, okay, is it economically worthwhile?
So is it economically worthwhile?
Our budget model showed that it was, yes, largely because of the price premium. And so cider makers were willing to pay about, and we've done some, our recent data showing about 36 cents a pound for cider-specific varieties, so those with high concentrations of tannins or acids or some combination of different chemical compounds that would make them different than what could be purchased as off of the culinary apple supply chain. So by comparison, like a processing apple, one that's going to head towards like juice is going to be 8-9 cents a pound.
And you're saying like just apple juice, something like that Martinelli's would kick out?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
Any number, Mott's juice place,
right?
whatever.
Any number of companies, and so it's a when you get to juice or what they call processing fruit, it becomes a commodity market, and it's definitely a fairly low price. And so the growers who can make a living growing for that market are usually very large scale, right? So it's kind of the if you're big enough and you're not making very much on every pound of apples that you sell, but you're selling a lot of pounds of apples, you can make a profit.
You can hang in there.
Yeah.
So it's a commodity market, and then the cider apple would be called...
It's a special market.
Special market. It's still a commodity, but it's a special...
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if we're at the scale yet.
Okay, not yet, but I'm hopeful. Hopeful.
But yeah, I mean, me too. I mean, certainly in other parts of the world it is, and in England, for example. So here are some interesting statistics. New York State is the second largest apple producer in the country. We grow about 40,000 acres of apples. And we did some survey work. I worked with an extension group called Harvest New York, and we asked as many people growing apples in the state to tell us how many acres of cider apples they had back about 3 years ago. And we only found about 200 acres of these specialized, high tannin, high acid cider apples, things that would be destined only for making cider.
Of established orchards, 200 acres.
Established or in that were planted, So
okay. All right.
So like in the ground.
Got it.
Maybe not producing fruit yet because a lot of these orchards are young.
Right.
We know that there's been tremendous growth even in the last 3 years. There's a lot more of trees in the ground, but it's very difficult to get numbers on it. We've been trying really hard to figure that out because it's important for us to understand when I have to justify what I'm doing to my my supervisor and also to try to get grant dollars to do my research, I have to say, okay, this industry is big enough to have some of that funding or some of my time to work on it. Right? I mean, I have to justify that. So that's why those numbers are really important to me. And I think everybody's kind of curious to know, like,
Yeah, I want to keep on hearing. Yeah.
you want to see it's growing. And so by comparison, in the United Kingdom, they have about 40,000 acres of apples altogether as well. So kind of similar acreage to New York State. But about half of those acres are dedicated for cider apples.
Do you know where the most highest concentration of the cider apples are in the UK? Because I was just having this conversation. I wonder if what I heard there was what you might say too.
So Herefordshire is the
highest concentration.
Yeah, that is.
That
and then,
absolutely makes sense.
And then followed by Somerset, and then
okay.
some of the surrounding counties as well have some sizable production.
Right. So in terms of cider-specific apples.
Correct, yeah. And actually, what they call top fruit, which are what we call culinary apples or fresh market apples, they actually grow those. So Herefordshire, Somerset, that's the western part of the country. And actually the top fruit, as they call it, is grown on the eastern part of the country. And
Kent.
for a lot of, in that region, close to Kent. And for a lot of historic reasons and some climatic reasons as well. And just kind of the industries are... separate locations. There's some overlap, but
Yeah. It's so interesting. And when you say cider apples, now that's kind of like a kind of a loose term I'm finding these days. I've been having a lot of conversations this week. I don't know if we should really touch upon it, but I do want to talk to you about your current study and also your grad students and anybody who wants to come into this type of program.
Sure.
Those are like three main areas I want to talk about.
Yeah.
Coming into a program like this, what your students are currently doing, and what your big focus is. Because I heard something about tannins.
Yeah.
So
let's tackle the question of what's a cider apple.
Okay.
Because that's a big question for me in my research program. So as a pomologist studying cider production, my area of really focused research is in what should we grow, or what should the apple growers grow, and how do we grow them? So what apples should we grow, and how do we grow those apples? So that question of what is a cider apple comes up an awful lot for me as well.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, there's no single definition. And I think in the United States, when we say that, a lot of times people are referring to high tannin varieties, so varieties that would fit a chemical kind of what's missing in the chemistry of fresh market apples. So fresh market apples tend to have a lot of acidity. They have moderate levels of sugar, but very low levels of tannins. And that's because, frankly, they're not very pleasant to eat when you eat an apple, right? You don't want a very high tannin apple off the tree and eat it. Some people will say they do, but by and large, our consumers do not, right? They want sweet, they want crisp, they want acid, but not tannins. So in the overall production of apples in the United States, as I was mentioning earlier, there's very few of these high tannin types of apples. Now a cider apple, in the broadest sense, is any apple that you have, because they all contain sugar, and yeast can convert that sugar into alcohol, and therefore you have cider, right? So in a very, I'm a scientist, so I think about these things and try to, in the simplest, plainest terms, any apple is a cider apple. But really what we're talking about is the difference between cider apples and culinary apples, which would be the analogy would be between a wine grape and a table grape, right? So there's a big difference between the grapes that you buy in the supermarket for fresh eating and a Pinot Noir, right? And Pinot Noir, they're fun to eat, a couple of them in a bunch, but you're not going to eat them as a snack all day long, and they have tough skins, they have a lot more phenolics, they have seeds. There's a lot of characteristics that make them not so great for fresh eating. But you can take a table grape and you could turn it into juice and ferment it. There's no reason why you couldn't. It would turn into wine. It wouldn't be fantastic wine, but it would be wine. And so that's the analogy to apples. And I think that's kind of, because it's in the United States, it's, this kind of reemergence of cider. There's a lot of education around that and a lot of questions about, And we also have the issue in the United States is that cider and especially in New England, is that cider meant that brown, cloudy juice that you would buy when you went apple picking, and also get some, cider donuts with a little bit of cinnamon on them, which is fantastic, and I love that.
Right.
But by and large, even with, and you and I are immersed in the world of cider, and so we think cider all the time and don't even think twice about it. But for the everyday consumer who may not have tried a cider, or maybe they've only tried a handful of ciders, they still think if you say cider to them, they're going to think brown, cloudy juice and not fermented beverage.
Right.
And then, a lot of cider producers are working really hard to create some sort of market segregation for themselves, try to make themselves stand out in the marketplace. And so there's all sorts of different, ways of describing cider, and, different people have different terminology. And, it's fun to watch and see how that evolves.
It's going to take a little bit of time to kind of find its spot, I think, but that's
Absolutely.
Okay. That's part of the process.
Yeah. So after Prohibition, well, one more thing.
Oh yeah, please go
Sorry to
ahead.
interrupt, 'cause I'll just go
No.
on.
Please do interrupt me, and you keep on going on.
This is what happens. You come to Professor Peck's office, and then you get earful, and you're like,
I'm going to camp out here.
You're like, I'm supposed to be the interviewer and ask questions, but Greg's just going to keep talking.
Keep talking.
So,
Greg.
After Prohibition, not only did we see cider largely disappear from the types of alcohol that was being consumed by Americans, but so did wine. So did grape-based wines, right? And it wasn't really until the a little bit of production started in the 50s, but not really until the 70s did the California wine industry start to gain some traction and a reputation. So it really hasn't been that long, even for the wine in the United States to gain a foothold and now become a real powerhouse internationally. And so, maybe cider, the cider industry took its time and kind of has evolved in the footsteps of the wine industry. But on the other hand, I think the acceptance of cider is going to happen very rapidly. And I think it's going to be, we're already seeing it. In New York State alone, we have 100 cider producers. And so if you kind of think about that, it's like, well, okay, 10 years ago, we had just a couple few, and you can count them on hand.
Oh my God!
And they didn't have a national or a state association to help them change legislation to help them increase sales or help navigate things like the TTB or to help do promotional work for them. And so now all those things are happening, and they're happening very rapidly, and they're building on the footsteps of the wine trail. They're building on the footsteps of craft beer industry. They're building on a millennial generation that is very open to trying new foods and is looking for new experiences and, is seemingly, the demographic information is saying they're seemingly a lot less interested in the kind of prestige of a certain, type of product and looking more at what are the, types of things that really that I enjoy consuming. So in other words, it's not like I have to drink red wine because that's what everybody drinks at, Friday night dinner, but more now it's a little bit more open with this generation, which is cool because those are your consumers, right? Those are your 18 to 25-year-olds.
Yeah, and they want to know where the product's coming from, too.
Yeah.
And you're probably seeing that more and more. I wanted to ask you, because I want to ask the pomologist, such an opportunity, heritage apples, because that's also a thing that gets really kind of muddled, at least in the U.S. it's a term, heritage apples. I'm not really seeing it outside of the U.S. at all, and Greg's shaking his head. So how do you define that, or do you? Or
So I mentioned earlier I worked for the Sonoma Antique Apple Nursery, so we'd call them antique apples back at a certain time.
Right.
The word heirloom often gets used as well. Particularly for like vegetables, heirloom vegetable seeds, right? That's kind of it. The term heritage, it's another term in there. I think, what they're trying to say is, hey, these are apples that are not the mainstream commercial apples. And these are apples that may have some sort of history, either here in the States or elsewhere, and maybe have a story or a place that are identified with that apple.
Is there a
It's kind of
certain time
interesting.
that an apple has to be out to be in that kind of antique apple category?
You know, it's not defined by any sort of regulatory body, so I
Right.
think it's very much open for debate or
Right.
interpretation by the people that you know who are trying to use that terminology. So it's there's lots of quirky things, right? So let's say you got some apples from a breeding program that the plant breeder gave you that are very interesting apples that make fantastic cider. But they were crosses that happened in the 1990s. And these are very unusual apples that could be used for cider production, but they're not really antiques. So, but they have a great story. They have maybe they fit a niche within the cider consumer palate that you're trying to make a product for. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's kind of, for me as a scientist, I'd say when you start talking about that terminology, it's less about objective science and say, okay, anything before this date is heritage or antique or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's more about the marketing, and people are trying to figure out, again, how am I going to make a product that is going to command the attention of the consumer and hopefully allow the business to be economically sustainable.
Is there an oldest apple in the U.S.? Is like the Roxbury Russet the oldest? Can that even be categorized? I just wonder if that's like a quirky kind of fact.
Yeah.
Unknown.
I'm sure that there are probably some apple historians out there who would like to debate that. It's off the top of my head, I'm not really sure. The first European colonists brought with them. First they tried to bring trees, and they all died in transit, and so then seeds were brought over. And so, those seeds are, each one of them can be a unique apple variety. And so possibly it was one of those, possibly it was some cross of that first generation that happened. And I don't know. And
So
then
it's more about a historian question than a pomologist question. That's good to know.
I'm a pomological historian. I just, off the top of my head, I'm not really sure.
Yeah. Well, fair enough. So if somebody wants to become a pomologist, what would be like undergraduate, because it's really graduate study work that you become a pomologist. So is there undergraduate study work that you should be looking at to build up to enter into a program here at Cornell?
Great question. So at Cornell, we teach a number of classes in horticulture in both our plant science and our agricultural science majors. And within those subject areas, those majors, students can take classes like my classes. I teach a class in ecological orchard management. I teach a class on fruit crop physiology, where we really get into the biochemistry and the genetics of fruit production. And I also teach a class with Kathy Arnick, who's a enologist or a wine scientist, on cider production. And we had about 100 students in that class last semester.
Wow.
So the students are interested.
It's starting to grow, right?
And-
Versus in the past, would you have less or?
I mean, I
you've
think
seen
before the cider
it?
boom happened, I don't know if we would have
Good time to
attracted
be
that
here.
many students in there. So we definitely offer classes for undergraduate students. You don't come to study cider as an undergraduate. You come to study a broader topic, and within there you can take classes such as mine to kind of learn what you need to learn to go out into industry.
What would be a good undergraduate degree to get to bring you there? Would it be biology?
Well, I mean,
I'm just
for us it would be plant science.
Or
okay. Agricultural science.
Okay.
We also have a viticulture and enology major, so that would be a little bit more grape and wine specific, but a lot of that information, particularly on the winemaking side, is directly translatable to cider production.
Absolutely.
So the undergraduates get the opportunity to learn about these, but undergraduate education is meant to be a little bit broader, teach them the fundamentals for being able to either go out into industry or to go and advance their education by taking another degree or other opportunities. We also do training for graduate students. So I have currently 3 graduate students who are working on projects related to cider production, which is great, and being able to get funding for that. And so I have a student who's looking at crop load management and how to manage biennial bearing in cider apple varieties. I have a student who's looking at how do we manage nitrogen in orchards.
Oh, okay.
And so, in terms of, when we apply nitrogen to orchards, which is, common fertilizer, it's a, we'll call it macronutrient, one of the key nutrients that's important for plants to grow. And nitrogen is, very important agriculturally because it produces a lot of vegetative growth. And so we're looking at, well, how does that affect fruit quality for cider production? And in moderate amounts, we're finding it to be a really big win, meaning that the addition of nitrogen to the orchard increased productivity, it increased yields, it increased the concentration of what's called yeast assimilable nitrogen, which is the fraction of nitrogen that yeast need for their metabolism. So we're actually able to directly increase that, which is very helpful for fermentation. And then had basically no negative effects on things like polyphenols, which was kind of this idea that was out there that if you increased, if you applied nitrogen fertilizer to orchards, you would decrease the amount of phenolics you'd have in your fruit. And we've shown that not to be the case. And so it's basically a win. Now, like all things, everything in moderation. And and so if you over-apply fertilizer, then you have environmental issues. But if you are nitrogen starving your orchard, thinking that you're going to get higher fruit quality from it, you're probably actually doing yourself a disservice.
Now, I was talking to Ian, your predecessor here, about nitrogen, and he was talking about the soil around here and it actually not needing it. So soil is a huge factor in this because that's where the nitrogen is going to be applied or not applied. So regionally, that's very dependent first at looking at the soil. And so out of that study, that work there that is happening now with this grad student, I imagine that work, when it becomes published, people will be able to look at that and be able to then assess, bring soil samples to maybe their local universities or programs and get a better understanding. So that would be like the head start going in there. Right?
Yeah,
that's what it's all about.
Exactly right.
Okay.
And so the study that we did is actually on these soils that have a fair amount of organic matter. And even in these soils with high organic matter, we find this benefit. And so we did it in different ways. We applied the nitrogen onto the trees in a foliar spray. We also did another study where we ground applied it, and either way it was a real benefit. So we had less issues also with hydrogen sulfide, which is that rotten egg or skunky smell that you can get out of cider sometimes. And that's usually when you don't have enough nitrogen in the juice. And so producers will often add exogenous or nitrogen from another source to the juice before or during fermentation to try to alleviate that issue. But we're finding that we can actually manage that in the orchard.
In the soil, yeah. Fantastic. And there was another study too? Was there a third study?
Yeah, and then another study we're working on right now is looking at how to manage harvest maturity for cider apples and pre-harvest drop. And so that's a really big issue because a lot of the European cider apples in particular were chosen because as a benefit that they actually drop fruit to the ground, because they were harvesting off the ground, either traditionally with baskets and just kind of scooping up the apples, or now with pretty large-scale machinery in the largest orchards in Europe, where they actually go through and will, pick them up with either tractor-mounted or even sometimes standalone machines. So in the U.S., we currently don't have very many of those machines, probably people will start importing them as their orchards get larger. But a lot of our growers want to be able to harvest fruit off of the tree. And so we're looking at try to manage that so that we can try to keep the apples on the tree and then be able to get them off of the tree. So we're doing different techniques to do that.
I'm kind of curious about that topic because I see like the Europeans having a head start because they're able to use these machines at a cidery, sweep it up. They don't have to, they can let it drop and they just not worrying about that the government's not regulating and saying you can't use drops. And here in the U.S., cider makers are really kind of up against the wall there, having to pay a high amount for labor to pick apples, especially as you get that economy of scale going up. And because the government's saying, no, you can't use drops unless, and there's a concern that that might be taken away too altogether unless it's picked. So is that what this research might kind of help in that argument one way or the other?
Yeah,
because that's a big one.
It's a really hot button topic, and the whether or not that. So currently, you can use drops for cider production, but you have to be able to in New York State. You can at least, but there's a concern that the new Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA as they call it, may make it more difficult in the future to use ground harvested fruit. So absolutely, we're trying to figure that out. And if we do have to pick them off the tree, how do we do that? How do we do that mechanically, perhaps? And then also, working with colleagues to figure out, like, well, is this really a concern? To use ground harvested fruit. And so the body of literature out there shows that using ground harvested fruit for fermentation, for fermented cider,
where alcohol's being produced,
where yeast are metabolizing the compounds, or the actual alcohol itself is basically a disinfectant, can actually reduce risk below a threshold, at which point it should be safe. But you can tell the caution in my voice and tone here.
I do.
Because when we start talking about these things, we're talking about, not only are we talking about human health and safety, but we're also talking about a large body of regulations, and it's very complicated. And so my area of research is helping to inform that, but I'm not the regulator. I'm not the one who gets to make these rules. And so we're just trying to figure out, like, okay, how do we work with these?
Everybody's ear is craning right now, listening, and the eyes are widening, and like there's a wish going to the sky. All you cider makers out there, me included, raise your glass to the sky and hope that they find. I know that Greg can't say this, and he has to be a scientist, but in truth, I'm hoping that it could kind of help the industry, especially the small boutique makers that are working a lot, sometimes with giant standard trees, old orchards, and it could really change the paradigm. So and go back to the economic study that I mentioned earlier. Easily for a more modern type of orchard, a high density orchard, 30 to 35% of your annual enterprise budget, your annual cost of production, goes to harvest labor. So I think the point that you're making about the competitive disadvantage that our producers would be at to not be able to use ground harvested fruit would be tremendous at the large scale and at the small scale as well, because the availability of labor is a perennial problem, and probably because it's so politically charged, not going away anytime soon for us. That's right.
And so, we've got a crop, and we've got ways of selling that crop or turning it into cider and selling the cider, but we need to figure out how to get that crop out of the field and into consumers' hands.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a big one. Now, so you have your grad students. Does Greg have a special project? Is that how that works? I don't really understand that. Do you have something that is like your passion project right now? And that's probably not the right thing to call it, but I imagine you become passionate about it. You wouldn't pick a topic unless.
Yeah. So one project that I've had a number of grad students and my technicians working on with me is we're exploring the diversity of cider apples. So on one hand of the spectrum, I am looking at how do we narrow the pool of varieties so that our growers can get reliable varieties. And we have a list of about 6 or so European varieties that we think we recommend for New York growers at this time. But on the other end of the spectrum, hey, what else is out there? Because there are so many apples, right? I mean, there's tens of thousands of different apples. I mean, the number you'd look up would be, you often see in the internet, like 7,000 different types of apples. Probably 2-3 times that many of varieties out there. And we're creating new ones all the time, both in land-grant university breeding programs, but also there's a lot of cider makers who are playing around and doing some backyard breeding and trying to come up with their own, cider apple that's locally adapted to their climate. So a resource that we have available to us in this area is maintained by the USDA, and it's called the Plant Genetics Resource Unit, or PGRU. You'll often hear it referred to, or sometimes the Malus Germplasm Collection it's referred to. And so this is maintained by the USDA on land that they rent from Cornell University, and they have over 3,000 unique varieties, apple varieties there. So a small subset of the total that are out there, but pretty extensive collection. And these are apple varieties that are from all over the world, from the United States, but also from Europe, from both Eastern and Western Europe, from Asia, from the Southern Hemisphere. I mean, basically, there have been introductions coming in from all over the world, and it really represents an amazing genetic diversity of germplasm. And we've been now, for the past few years, going up on a weekly basis to that collection, and we have a list of varieties that we either have been reported in the literature for being useful for cider production, or that we have some information from databases that suggest that they could be, but even if no one is currently using them for cider production, they're astringent, or they have high acid, or they're other characteristics that we think they might be useful for cider production. And so we harvest those apples, we bring them back to my lab here, we mill and juice them in our small benchtop juicer that mimics what a commercial press does. And then we chemotype them, meaning that we measure all the chemical properties that are important for cider makers. So the sugars and the sorbitol and the phenolics and the acidity and the nitrogen content and all of these different things. And we're really kind of looking at what we kind of know some of these well-known European cider varieties, but what else is out there? And that's going to be a lot of fun. So that data is forthcoming. We're hopefully try to get all that together and publish it this winter.
Congratulations. I hope that your deadline for that happens. I'm counting on it. So would that be kind of like in some ways almost like an Excel sheet, where you'd be able to say, okay, Kingston Black, right, the classic, cider variety that people really want, and it has these properties in it. It's more stretched out in a very tech level. Yeah,
so we hope to get to that point where we can create some outward facing database of this information, so that somebody could say, hey, I like Kingston Black juice, but I don't like the way it performs horticulturally. Are there other things that have similar juice quality that I should try? And then try to use some sorting categories in there. Or hey, I'm really interested in this obscure French cider apple. Are there any, does anybody growing this around the country, or does anybody have this in a research trial? And try to pull in that information into some sort of database.
That was Gregory Peck of Cornell University in the School of Integrative Plant Science and the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, speaking with us today. And I just want to say how much I admire him, the work that he's doing, and particularly the way he works with the students that are moving the research forward. He's just so compassionate and really encouraged me to speak with them, which I did at great length. Just a wonderful person, and we're lucky to have him. So big tip of the glass to Greg, and do go to the show notes to see more information and links there, including, again, I'm going to be posting the links from Deborah Cooper, who was on episode 196, which was all about the Mann Library digital resources and special collections. So that's what I'm going to be listening to the show notes there. If you didn't hear that episode, you want to go back and listen to it. She just gave a whole bunch of details on amazing things that can now be available if you're doing any kind of research in this area. And a big tip of the glass to all the good folks who are patrons of this here podcast via the Cider Chat Patreon page. Check it out by Googling Patreon Cider Chat. And join the campaign today to help keep cider going up around the world. And before I roll out of here, well, you know I am counting down to my 200th episode of this here podcast. The next one is 99, and then we're one slot away. And I just want to put it out, if you have a little recording, if you want to just pick your little smartphone up and sing any part of the We Like Cider song, and send it to me, I just may air that on the 200th episode. So again, I'm looking for recordings of friends or musical pieces of the We Like Cider song to showcase on the 200th episode. Get in on it. Get in on the celebration about cider and all the good cheer around the world. You could hear the full song at the end of this here episode. In the meanwhile, I'm rolling out of here. This is Rhea Windcaller signing off for now. Looking forward to seeing you in Ciderville.
We like cider. We like palms. We love orchards. There is a reason why we do it like this. Yes, there is. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh, yes, there is. There is a reason why we do it like this. Yes, there is a reason why we do it like this. We like walking through the orchards, dancing in the street, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. We like cider. We like palms. We like orchards, having some fun. There is a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes, there is. There's a reason why we do it like this. Oh yes, there is. There is a reason why we drink it like this. Yes, there is. There is a reason. We like walking down the orchards, dancing in the street, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. Oh yeah. We like cider. Oh yes we do. We like palms. Oh yes we do. We love orchards, having some fun. There is a reason why we do it like this. There is a reason why we do it like Walking down the orchards, dancing in the street, smelling all the blossoms, kicking up our feet. Oh yeah.